When my mother-in-law, Vivienne, dropped a single, pristine $20 bill onto the polished mahogany dining table to cover her share of a $300 brunch, she didn't look at me. She looked at her son, Julian, sighed with a delicate, practiced frailty, and whispered, "It must be nice to have so much of someone else's money to spend." That was the narrative they had spun from the moment Julian brought me to the family estate in Vermont. That Linnea Vance, a scholarship-bred textile conservator, had systematically hollowed out their son's defenses to secure a lifetime of family funding. They didn't know that for the last 4 years, Julian's prestigious architectural firm had been quietly hemorrhaging cash, or that it was my restoration contracts keeping our mortgage paid. They only knew what they wanted to believe, right up until the afternoon we sat in a windowless conference room on the 11th floor of a Boston law firm, listening to the reading of Julian's grandfather's will. The air in the attorney's office smelled of old parchment and the sharp, chemical tang of expensive citrus cleaner. Vivienne sat to my right, her fingers tightly interlaced around a quilted Chanel clutch, her posture rigid as an iron spike. Beside her was Julian's sister, Beatrix, who had spent the entire morning pointedly ignoring my presence, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet every time I glanced her way. They expected a coronation. Grandfather Arthur had been a man of immense wealth and even greater silence, a patriarch who ruled his shipping empire with a cold, analytical precision. The lawyer, a graying man named Mr. Abernathy, cleared his throat, the sound scraping against the quiet room. He adjusted his half-moon spectacles and began reading the standard boilerplate text, his voice a steady, rhythmic drone that did nothing to calm the tight, twisting knot in my stomach. I looked down at my hands, noticing a faint, stubborn trace of indigo dye beneath my fingernails from a 19th century tapestry I'd been stabilizing earlier that week. A worker's hands. To Vivienne, they were the hands of a thief. "To my daughter, Vivienne," Mr. Abernathy read, his cadence never wavering. "I leave the primary residence in Manchester, along with a designated trust for its maintenance, totaling $200,000. Vivienne blinked, her chin lifting slightly. It was a comfortable inheritance, but her eyes narrowed. She had expected the liquid assets, the bulk of the offshore accounts. "To my granddaughter, Beatrix, the sum of $50,000, the lawyer continued. Beatrix stiffened, her hand dropping from her bracelet. "And to my grandson, Julian." Julian leaned forward, his breathing shallow. He needed this. He needed the infusion of capital to bury the debts he had hidden from everyone but me. The commercial real estate holdings in South Boston, subject to the outstanding liabilities attached to the properties. Julian's face went entirely bloodless. The liabilities on those old warehouses were public record. They were an albatross, not a lifeline. Mr. Abernathy turned a heavy page. The crisp sound seemed to echo in the small room. He looked up, his eyes resting directly on me for a fraction of a second before returning to the document. "Finally, regarding the residual estate, including all remaining liquid capital, investment portfolios, and the personal archives of my late wife, totaling $14.2 million. Vivienne let out a soft, satisfied breath, already leaning toward Julian, preparing to squeeze his arm. "I leave the entirety to Linnea Vance." The silence that followed was absolute. The background hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to vanish entirely. I froze, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as Vivienne's head snapped toward me, her eyes darkening with a sudden, feral fury. No one moved. For 5 seconds, the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner of the office. Then, Vivienne stood up. The movement was so abrupt her heavy mahogany chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "There is a mistake," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying, brittle sharpness. She didn't look at the lawyer. Her eyes were locked onto my face, tracing the line of my jaw as if searching for the physical manifestation of a lie. Mr. Abernathy read that line again. My father was 92 years old. His mind was slipping. "Your father's mental competency was evaluated and certified by 2 independent medical professionals 3 days before he executed this codicil, Vivienne," Mr. Abernathy replied calmly. He didn't lift his gaze from the paperwork. neatly tapping the edges of the pages against the desk to align them. The document is ironclad. It was executed 6 months ago. 6 months ago. 6 months ago, I had spent 3 weeks in the climate-controlled basement of Arthur's estate, painstakingly restoring a collection of hand-woven French tapestries that had belonged to his late wife, Clara. It was a brutal, meticulous job that required me to sit in the damp chill for 10 hours a day, using micro-tweezers to reweave rotting silk fibers. Everyone else in the family had refused to visit him that month. Manchester was too depressing. In the late autumn, Beatrix had said. But I had gone. Arthur would sit in the corner of the basement in his wheelchair, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching me work in absolute silence. I thought he was judging my technique. I thought he was watching me because he, too, suspected I was trying to steal a piece of his family's history. Now I turned to look at Julian, my husband. He hadn't moved. His hands were still flat on the conference table, his knuckles white against the dark wood. He wasn't looking at his mother, and he wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the space right between us, his mouth slightly open. The $14 million wouldn't just save his firm, it would elevate him to the status he had spent his entire life pretending he already possessed. But it wasn't his. It was mine. "Linnea," Julian whispered, his voice cracking slightly as he finally turned his head to look at me. It wasn't a voice of anger. It was the voice of a man who had suddenly lost his footing on a familiar path. Did you know about this?" Of course she knew, Beatrix spat, standing up to join her mother. The diamond tennis bracelet caught the harsh fluorescent light of the office, flashing mockingly. "Look at her. She's been playing the quiet, suffering martyr for years, pretending she's content with our leftovers while she was whispering in an old man's ear. You manipulated a dying man, Linnea. You're disgusting." The sheer weight of their collective hatred felt physical, pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. For 4 years, I had swallowed their insults. I had smiled when Vivienne gifted me her old, stained tablecloths for Christmas. I had stayed silent when Beatrix suggested I shouldn't wear my off-the-rack dress to the museum gala because it might reflect poorly on Julian's brand. I had endured it all because I loved Julian, and I believed that eventually they would see I wasn't the parasite they thought I was. I pulled my hands back into my lap, folding them over my knees to hide the fact that they were shaking. I looked Vivienne dead in the eye. "I didn't know," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I never asked your father for a single dime." Vivienne let out a short, ugly laugh that sounded completely unhinged compared to her usual polished demeanor. She leaned down, placing both hands on the table, bringing her face inches from mine. The scent of her expensive French perfume was suffocating. "We will fight this, Linnea. We will tie you up in litigation until every dollar of that money is consumed by legal fees. You will not see a single cent of my family's blood money. Enjoy the drive home with my son, because it's the last luxury you will ever experience at our expense." Drive back to our townhouse in Brookline was a study in absolute suffocating silence. The windshield wipers swept a steady, rhythmic pattern against the glass, clearing away a heavy spring mist that matched the gray mood inside the car. Julian kept both hands wrapped around the steering wheel at precisely 10 and 2, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the brake lights of the sedan in front of us. Usually, Julian filled the silence. He would talk about clients, about blueprints, about the sheer exhausting pressure of maintaining his firm's reputation. But today, the silence stretched for 40 minutes, heavy and dense, until it felt like a third passenger sitting between us on the leather console. "Julian," I said softly, the sound of my own voice shocking me after the long quiet. "Please say something." He didn't turn his head. He just eased his foot onto the brake as we hit a patch of traffic near the river. "What do you want me to say, Linnea? My mother is calling our corporate attorneys right now. Beatrix is hysterical. And my grandfather just handed my wife the keys to the kingdom while leaving me with 2 failing warehouses and a mountain of commercial debt." "I didn't ask for this," I whispered, reaching out to touch his sleeve. The fabric of his coat felt rough beneath my fingers. "You were there. You saw how Arthur was. He barely spoke to me. I was just fixing his wife's tapestries." Julian pulled his arm back slightly, adjusting his grip on the wheel. The rejection was subtle, but it stung worse than any of Vivienne's overt insults. "He spoke to you enough to change his will, Linnea, 6 months ago. That was right after the Thanksgiving dinner where my mother made that comment about your family's lack of a trust fund. Did you tell him about that? Did you complain to him?" I stared at him, my throat tightening. "You think I used your grandfather as a weapon against your mother?" "I don't know what to think," he said, his voice dropping to a low, exhausted murmur as he pulled the car onto our street. "All I know is that tomorrow morning, my payroll is due for the quarterly architectural draftsman, and the firm's operating account has exactly $4,000 in it. I was counting on that inheritance to keep us afloat, Linnea. I was counting on it to keep you in this house." He parked the car but left the engine running, the low vibration humming through the floorboards. He finally looked at me, his eyes rimmed with red, a desperate, calculating look creeping into his expression that I had never seen before. It was the look of a man who was drowning, suddenly realizing that the person next to him was holding the only life vest. "If you didn't know about it, then it's a mistake," Julian said, his tone shifting into something terrifyingly transactional, the voice he used when negotiating with difficult contractors. "When Mr. Abernathy calls tomorrow to finalize the paperwork, you can sign a waiver. We can disclaim the residual estate and let it flow back into the primary family trust. That way, the lawsuits go away. My mother stops tracking our every move, and we can use my share to fix the firm." He reached across the console, his hand covering mine. His palm was cold. "We can fix this together, Linnea, as a team, just like we always have." I looked down at his hand, then out the window at our small, beautifully manicured front yard. For 4 years, I had been the team player. I had taken extra restoration jobs, working until midnight under halogen lamps, just so Julian could pretend to his colleagues that his lifestyle was funded entirely by his own success. I had protected his pride at the cost of my own health. "And if I don't sign it, Julian?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely flat. "What happens then?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He slowly withdrew his hand from mine, the warmth of his palm vanishing instantly, replaced by the cool dampness of the car's air conditioning. He turned the key, killing the engine, and the sudden drop in noise made the sound of my own breathing feel entirely too loud. "If you don't sign it," he said, staring straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield, "then my mother is going to make our lives an absolute living hell. And honestly, Linnea, I don't know if I'll have the energy to protect you from her anymore." The word protect hung in the air like a bad joke. Julian had never protected me. When Vivienne remarked that my mother's second-hand cardigan looked delightfully rustic at our rehearsal dinner, Julian had simply laughed and told me his mother was just being traditional. When Beatrix conveniently forgot to include me in the family portrait at the country club, Julian had told me I was being overly sensitive. He didn't protect me. He managed me. He kept me quiet, so his family's surface could remain perfectly smooth. "I see," I said softly. I reached for the door handle, the cold metal biting into my fingers. "Let's go inside." Our townhouse was dark, smelling of the lavender wax I used to polish the antique sideboard. Usually, coming home felt like a relief, but tonight the walls felt narrow, pressing in on me. Julian left his briefcase by the door and went straight to the kitchen, pouring himself 3 fingers of scotch. He didn't offer me any. He swallowed half of it in one throat-burning gulp, his back turned to me. "My mother called 5 times while we were driving," he said, his voice tight. He held up his phone, the screen illuminating the tense lines of his face. "She wants a family meeting tomorrow at her house. Just the 3 of them, her, Beatrix, and me. She said if I bring you, she'll have the security guard at the gate turn us away." "Are you going?" I asked, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, still wearing my coat. Julian set the glass down on the marble counter with a sharp clink. "I have to, Linnea. My entire financial future is tied up in those South Boston warehouses grandfather left me. If my mother pulls her corporate backing from my firm out of spite because of what you're holding on to, I'm ruined by Tuesday. I have to go smooth things over." He looked at me then, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw a flicker of genuine resentment in his eyes. It wasn't the passing annoyance of a disagreement over dinner. It was the deep, curdling bitterness of a man who realized his wife, possessed something he could only ever beg for. "Just think about the waiver," he muttered, brushing past me into the living room. "Please, before tomorrow morning." I didn't answer. I walked up the stairs to my small studio on the 3rd floor, where the air smelled of linseed oil and aged wool. On my work table sat a ledger Arthur had given me during my last week at his estate. It was a simple, leather-bound notebook full of his late wife, Clara's notes on her textile collection. I opened it to the very last page, where Arthur had written a small note in his shaky, 92-year-old script, dated just days before the will was updated. To Linnea, it read, "They spend their lives measuring what they are owed. You are the only one who ever took the time to preserve what was already given. Don't let them tear down what you rebuild." My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an unknown number, but I knew the area code. I answered it, pressing the cold glass to my ear. "Linnea," Vivienne's voice came through the line, low, venomous, and entirely stripped of her upper-class politeness. "I'm offering you $500,000 to sign the disclaimer tomorrow morning. If you refuse, I will personally contact every museum and historical society on the East Coast. By Monday, you won't be able to get a contract to restore a dish towel, let alone a tapestry. Choose wisely." I didn't hang up. I stood there in the dim light of my studio, listening to the faint, jagged sound of Vivienne's breathing on the other end of the line. The threat was real. In my industry, reputation wasn't just an asset, it was the entire foundation. A few well-placed phone calls from a woman who sat on 3 major museum boards could quietly, permanently erase me from every restoration registry in New England. $500,000, Linnea, Vivienne repeated, her tone dropping into a smooth, predatory purr when I didn't immediately respond. "That is more money than your family has seen in 3 generations. It's enough to buy yourself a nice little shop somewhere far away from my son. Consider it a severance package for a marriage that was always an error in judgment." "I'll give you my answer tomorrow, Vivienne," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You'll give it to Julian before he leaves for my house," she corrected sharply. "If he arrives without that signed waiver in his hand, the gloves come off. Don't underestimate how small your world can become." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone, the plastic casing slick against my palm. I looked back down at Arthur's shaky handwriting in the ledger. "Don't let them tear down what you rebuild." He had known exactly what they would do. He had spent 90 years watching his family devour each other over fractions of a percent, and he had handed me this inheritance not as a gift of charity, but as a shield. Downstairs, the floorboards creaked. I walked to the top of the stairwell and looked down through the banister. Julian was still in the living room, sitting in the dark, the blue light of his laptop screen illuminating the sharp, desperate lines of his face. He was staring at a spreadsheet, the red numbers of his firm's debt projecting onto his white button-down shirt like a digital rash. He didn't hear me walk down the stairs. I stopped at the edge of the rug, watching him type a number, delete it, and rub his face with both hands, letting out a ragged, choked breath. "She called me," I said quietly. Julian jumped, his head snapping up. He quickly slid his laptop screen half closed, an instinctual gesture of concealment that made my stomach turn. "Who?" "My mother." "She offered me $500,000 to sign the waiver," I said, watching his eyes carefully. For a fraction of a second, a spark of sheer relief flashed across Julian's face. His shoulders dropped an inch. In his mind, the problem was solving itself. $500,000 would satisfy me, the waiver would satisfy his mother, and the family dynamics would return to their predictable, toxic equilibrium. That's a lot of money, Linnea," he said, his voice cautious, testing the waters. He stood up, walking toward me with his hands extended, trying to adopt the posture of the comforting husband again. "It's a clean break from the drama. We could use that money to clear the personal line of credit we took out for the firm, and we wouldn't have to deal with her lawyers. It's a win for everyone." "A win for everyone?" I echoed, stepping back so his hands missed my waist. "She just threatened to destroy my career, Julian. She told me she would blacklist me from every museum on the East Coast if I don't give her what she wants. And your first thought is that it clears your line of credit." Julian's face hardened, the comforting facade evaporating instantly. Be realistic, Linnea. You restore old blankets for a living. I build landmarks. If my firm goes under, we lose this house, we lose our standing, we lose everything. Your career is a hobby compared to what's at stake here. Word hobby hit me with the force of a physical blow, leaving a cold, hollow ache in the center of my chest. I looked at Julian, really looked at him, stripped of his expensive tailored shirt and his polished presentation voice. He was terrified, but worse than that, he was small. For 4 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into his shadow, believing his success was our success. Now I saw that to him, my life's work was just an optional ornament on his grand design. A hobby, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. You know what I mean, Julian said quickly, recognizing he'd crossed a line, though his tone remained defensive. He stepped toward the kitchen counter, picking up his empty glass just to have something to hold. I'm under an immense amount of pressure, Linnea. If I don't walk into my mother's house tomorrow with that signed waiver, she will withdraw her corporate guarantee on my firm's bank loans by noon. The bank will call the note. It's over for me. Everything I've built. Everything we built, I corrected him, my voice gaining a hard, steady edge he had never heard before. Who do you think paid the retaining fee for your lead structural engineer last winter, Julian? It wasn't your mother. It was my restoration contract with the Peabody Essex Museum. Julian looked away, his jaw tightening as he set the glass back down with a muffled thud. He couldn't deny it, so he did what he always did when cornered. He shifted the blame. If you really loved me, you wouldn't make me beg for this. You wouldn't let my family tear us apart over money that belongs to them anyway. It doesn't belong to them, I said firmly. Arthur chose me. I didn't wait for his reply. I walked past him, went up to our bedroom, and closed the door. I didn't sleep. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the rain turn the street lamps into blurry smudges of yellow light. I thought about Arthur sitting in that cold basement, watching me meticulously repair things that others had deemed too fragile or worthless to save. He hadn't been judging me. He had been testing me. At 7 o'clock the next morning, the shower ran downstairs. A few minutes later, Julian appeared in the bedroom doorway, dressed in his sharpest charcoal suit. He looked exhausted, bags dark under his eyes, but his expression was locked in a grim, determined mask. He walked over to the dresser, picked up a single piece of paper he had printed out in the night, a standard legal disclaimer of inheritance, and laid it down in front of me. Beside it, he placed a heavy silver Montblanc pen. The meeting is at 10, Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of affection. I need to leave by 9 to beat the traffic to Manchester. Sign it, Linnea. Let's just end this nightmare. I looked at the document, then up at my husband. I'm not signing it, Julian. Julian's face went entirely still. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. He didn't yell. Instead, a cold, dismissive sneer curled the corner of his mouth, the exact same sneer I had seen on Vivienne Wright's face 100 times. Fine, he said quietly, reaching down to snatch the paper and the pen back. Then you've made your choice. Don't expect me to stand in the way of what happens next. He turned on his heel and walked out, the heavy front door clicking shut downstairs moments later. I waited until the sound of his car faded down the street. Then, I picked up my phone and dialed Mr. Abernathy Wright's direct office line. Mr. Abernathy answered on the second ring, his voice as dry and professional as it had been the day before. Linnea, I assumed I would be hearing from you this morning. I need to see the full inventory of Arthur's residual estate, I said, leaning against the window frame, watching the gray morning fog roll across the neighborhood. Not just the financial figures, the personal archives, the things he left in the Manchester house. There was a brief pause, the sound of papers shifting on the other end of the line. The late Mr. Vance was incredibly meticulous, Abernathy replied. The personal archives consist of 42 cataloged crates stored in the climate-controlled attic of the primary residence. According to the terms of the will, you have immediate, unrestricted access to those items. However, given Vivienne's current occupancy of the house. The house belongs to Vivienne, but the contents of that attic belong to me, I interrupted, a strange, calm clarity settling over me. Am I legally allowed to retrieve them? Legally, yes. You hold the title to every item in that archive. But Linnea, if I may speak frankly, entering that property today, while the family is gathered, is a volatile choice. They are currently deciding how to destroy my life, Mr. Abernathy, I said softly, looking at the faint indigo stains still lingering on my fingertips. I think the time for avoiding volatility has passed. Can you email me the official courier release forms? They are already in your inbox, he said, and I could hear a faint, unexpected note of respect in the old lawyer's voice. Good luck, Linnea. An hour later, I was in my Volvo, driving north toward Vermont. The rain had stopped, but the highway was slick, reflecting the pale, watery sunlight. My mind wasn't on the $14 million. It was on the word hobby. It was on the 4 years I had spent holding my breath, waiting for permission to belong to a family that viewed me as a temporary infection. By the time I reached the iron gates of the Vance estate in Manchester, it was exactly 10:15. The security guard at the gatehouse, a man named Marcus who had tipped his hat to me for years, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and profound discomfort as I rolled down my window. Mrs. Vance, he stammered, looking at his clipboard. I was told by Ms. Vivienne that your vehicle wasn't authorized today. I'm not here to see Vivienne, Marcus, I said, handing him the notarized release forms Mr. Abernathy had sent. I am here as the sole executor and beneficiary of the Clara Vance archive. I have a legal right to retrieve my property from the attic. If you deny me entry, Mr. Abernathy will have a local sheriff here within 20 minutes to serve a court order. Marcus looked at the embossed legal seal on the document, then back at me. He swallowed hard, reached over, and pressed the button to raise the heavy iron gate. Have a safe day, ma'am. I drove up the long, winding gravel driveway, the tires crunching loudly in the quiet morning air. Parked in the circular brick courtyard was Julian's sleek black sedan, parked directly behind Vivienne S. Merced's. They were inside, sitting in the formal parlor, entirely unaware that the girl who restored old blankets had just entered the perimeter. I bypassed the grand double front doors, stepping instead through the side conservatory entrance, a route I knew well from my weeks spent working here. The air inside smelled of damp earth and damp ferns, a sharp contrast to the suffocatingly heavy floral scent Vivienne favored in the main house. As I closed the glass door behind me, the muffled sound of voices drifted down the long, carpeted hallway leading from the formal dining room. I paused, my back pressed against the cool brick wall. The bank needs a signed intent by Monday, Julian. Vivienne's voice was crisp, cutting through the quiet house like a razor. If Linnea thinks she can hold us hostage with my father's senile delusions, she is severely mistaken. I've already spoken to the board at the MFA. If she hasn't signed that waiver by tonight, her little conservation business won't survive the week. She's digging her heels in, Mother, Julian replied. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the booming confidence he usually projected. She's never looked at me the way she did this morning. I think she might actually be willing to walk away from the marriage over this. Let her, Beatrix chimed in, the distinct clink of a silver spoon against a porcelain teacup punctuating her words. She's a textile restorer, Julian. She's replaceable. The family name is. We can find you a dozen women who actually know how to dress for a gallery opening and don't smell like vinegar and stale wool. A heavy, suffocating silence followed her comment. I waited for Julian to say something. I waited for him to defend the woman who had spent the last 4 years skipping dinners and staying up until dawn to ensure his firm didn't collapse into bankruptcy. Just get the paperwork ready, Julian muttered quietly, his voice devoid of any warmth. If she won't sign it willingly, we'll use the leverage. I closed my eyes for a single beat, letting the last lingering fragment of hope wither away. The grief didn't crush me. Instead, it left behind a cold, crystalline stillness. I turned away from the hallway and walked silently toward the back staircase, the narrow, uncarpeted wooden steps used by staff that led directly to the third-floor attic. The attic door creaked softly as I pushed it open. The space was massive, stretching the entire length of the estate, illuminated by dusty shafts of pale sunlight cutting through the dormer windows. Stacked in neat, Precise rows were 42 heavy, climate-controlled aluminum crates, each bearing a white archival label with Grandfather Arthur's neat, block-letter handwriting. I walked to the nearest row and knelt beside crate number 1. My hands were perfectly steady now. I pulled the heavy latch back with a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the dusty rafters. Arthur hadn't just left me his wife's old sewing projects or a collection of dusty fabrics. As I lifted the heavy, rubber-sealed lid, the smell of lavender and cedar drifted up, revealing rows of meticulously cataloged leather ledger books, stock certificates, and personal correspondence dating back 50 years. I picked up the first ledger on top. It wasn't Clara's notes on textiles. It was a private, handwritten log kept by Arthur, tracking every single dollar he had funneled into Julian's firm over the last decade, and the secret agreements Vivienne had signed to secure those loans by putting up this very estate as collateral. They thought Arthur's mind was slipping. They didn't realize he had been documenting exactly how they were bankrupting the family legacy. And now, every single receipt belonged to me. I turned the pages of the ledger slowly, the crisp parchment scraping softly against the quiet of the attic. Arthur's handwriting was unyielding, tracking a decade of deceit with the cold precision of an accountant. Vivienne hadn't just put up the estate as collateral. She had systematically bled her father's liquid accounts to fund Julian's bleeding corporate image. Every trip to Europe, every luxury sedan, every single piece of jewelry Beatrix flaunted had been purchased with money extracted through frantic, emotional letters detailing Julian's impending ruin if his grandfather didn't step in. Beneath the ledgers lay a thick, legal-sized manila envelope sealed with red wax. On the front, Arthur had written 3 words, "The true account." Inside were the original deeds to the South Boston warehouses, the very properties Arthur had left to Julian in the public will. But enclosed with them was a private, unrecorded option agreement, fully executed by Arthur and his primary lenders 2 months ago. The liabilities Julian thought he was inheriting weren't standard commercial debts. They were personal indemnities. By accepting the properties, Julian wasn't just taking on bad real estate. He was legally absorbing his mother's hidden, personal lines of credit. Arthur hadn't just handed Julian an albatross. He had designed a financial trapdoor, and Vivienne had spent the last 24 hours pushing her son right onto it. A sharp click echoed from the far end of the attic. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Julian stepped into the dusty light, his jacket removed, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He stopped dead when he saw me kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the open aluminum crates. "Linnea," his voice was a mixture of shock and immediate defensive anger. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the loose grit of the attic floor. "What the hell are you doing here? Marcus told my mother your car was in the drive. She's downstairs calling the police right now." "Let her call them," I said, not looking up as I carefully placed the manila envelope into my leather work bag. "The police will look at the probate documents, look at Mr. Abernathy's courier release, and tell her it's a civil matter. I'm just collecting my property, Julian." "Your property?" Julian laughed, but the sound was hollow, trembling with a sudden, nervous energy as his eyes drifted to the open crates. "These are family archives. These belong to my grandmother. You have no right to come into this house and scavenge through our history." "Arthur gave me the right," I said, standing up and pulling the strap of my bag over my shoulder. I looked at him, seeing the pale, sweating skin of his forehead, the way his fingers twitched against his thigh. "And if you knew what was actually inside these crates, you'd be on your knees thanking me for coming here before your mother's lawyers got their hands on them." "What are you talking about?" He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to grab the edge of crate number 1, his knuckles whitening. "What's in there, Linnea? Is it more money? Did he hide bearer bonds? Tell me." The desperation radiating off him was pathetic. He didn't ask about our marriage. He didn't ask why I was hurting. He just saw another well to pump for his own survival. "It's not money, Julian," I said softly, walking past him toward the stairs. "It's the truth about your firm, and exactly how much your mother has been lying to you about who was keeping you afloat." Before he could process the words, the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps echoed up the wooden stairwell. Vivienne appeared in the doorway, her face pale with rage, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "Out of my house," Vivienne hissed, her voice vibrating with a raw, ugly venom that completely shattered her carefully cultivated New England poise. She lowered the phone, her knuckles white against the case. "The sheriff's department is sending a deputy. I will have you removed for trespassing, Linnea. I will make sure your name is dragged through every local paper from here to Boston." "I'm leaving, Vivienne," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm as I adjusted the heavy strap of my work bag. I took one step toward her, watching her eyes instinctively dart down to the leather bag resting against my hip. "But you might want to call the sheriff back and tell him to hurry. Not to arrest me, but to protect you from your son once he finishes reading what's left in those crates." Julian looked between us, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. "Mother, what is she talking about? What's in these ledgers?" He reached down, snatching the top book from crate number 1, his fingers fumbling with the aged leather binding. Vivienne's face went completely bloodless. For the first time since I had known her, the absolute certainty in her eyes flickered. She stepped into the attic, her designer heels clicking sharply against the raw wood, her hand reaching out toward Julian. "Julian, put that down. It's nonsense. My father was losing his mind at the end, writing down absolute fabrications. Linnea is just trying to divide us. She's trying to manipulate you because she knows she's caught." "Is she?" Julian muttered, his eyes scanning the first page of Arthur's neat, accounting script. I watched the exact moment he hit the entries from 3 years ago, the section detailing the $200,000 emergency injection Vivienne claimed she had secured from a private investor to save his firm's commercial portfolio. It hadn't been an investor. It had been Arthur's personal capital, traded directly for a secondary lien on Julian's own townhouse. "Julian, look at me," Vivienne commanded, her voice rising an octave, losing its smooth melody. "We are a family. We handle our affairs together." Whatever my father wrote in there, it was the product of a bitter, isolated old man. "You told me the bank cleared the secondary lien," Julian whispered, his head snapping up to look at his mother. The confusion on his face was rapidly curdling into something heavy and dangerous. "You told me you signed as a guarantor using your own liquid funds. Mother, where did the money for the Boston project actually come from?" "I am trying to save your firm," Vivienne snapped, her defensive veneer cracking entirely. "I have spent the last 5 years making sure you didn't disgrace the Vance name by filing for bankruptcy. If I had to adjust certain financial arrangements to do that, it was for your own good." I didn't stay to watch the rest of the collapse. I walked right past Vivienne, her expensive French perfume smelling faintly sour in the dusty air of the attic. She didn't even try to stop me. She was too busy watching her son realize that the mother who had spent years treating me like a parasitic gold digger was the very person who had quietly, systematically hollowed out his financial throat. As I descended the narrow wooden stairs, I could hear Julian's voice rising in a ragged, panicked shout, answered by the brittle, desperate screech of his mother's defense. I walked down to the second floor, then the first, the grand, empty rooms of the estate feeling less like a fortress and more like a beautifully decorated cage whose doors had just been unlocked. I stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the pale Vermont sun finally breaking through the gray clouds. I got into my Volvo, placed the leather bag containing the manila envelope on the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I pulled down the long gravel driveway, I passed a local sheriff's cruiser coming up the hill, its blue lights flashing silently. I didn't slow down. I had exactly what I came for, and for the first time in 4 years, I could breathe.